Yusuf, commonly known as Saladin Ayyubi, was born in 1138 in the city of Tikrit, north of Baghdad. His father Najmuddin Ayyub was in the service of the Seljuk emir Imaduddin Zengi. Imaduddin Zengi, a member of the Afshar tribe of the Oghuz, was appointed governor of Mosul in the last days of the Great Seljuk Empire and established the Mosul Atabeat. As a result of his efforts to unite Al Jazeera and Syria, the Zengis reached wide borders. Imaduddin Zengi put an end to the Crusader county of Edessa and subjugated the Damascus Atabeat to himself. However, his martyrdom during the siege of Jaffa mobilized his enemies. Upon his death, the papacy launched the Second Crusade to reclaim the lands they had lost in the eastern Mediterranean. Saladin Ayyubi was only 8 years old when Imaduddin Zengi died. Nureddin Zengi, who became the head of the Atabeat, took him under his protection at a young age and personally took care of his upbringing. Nureddin Zengi was married to the daughter of the Anatolian Seljuk Sultan Mesud I. He was educated in the fields of hadith and fiqh and was one of the most brilliant figures of the medieval Islamic world, having achieved great success in the art of warfare. He united the Islamic front against the Crusaders in the struggle against them, which he took over from his father Imaduddin Zengi, and ensured that the Second Crusade was neutralized. During his reign, he took back more than 50 cities from the Crusaders. As a result of Zengi's sacrifices, the Crusaders couldn't find the opportunity to advance further and were trapped in the coastline. Thus, Nureddin Zengi's prestige in the Islamic world had increased to the extent that it overshadowed the Seljuk dynasty. He had 3 dreams. The first was to unite Muslims and establish the Islamic Union. The second was to take back Jerusalem from the Crusaders. And the third was to conquer Constantinople. At that time, the Shiite Fatimid state was on its last legs. The internal turmoil and upheavals in the country were endless. The Fatimid ruler Al-Adid li-Dinillah was a young man who had ascended the throne at the age of 12. Viziers ruled the country on his behalf. The Crusader states, who were afraid of Nureddin Zengi, wanted to take advantage of the weakness of the Shiite Fatimid state, which was also Nureddin's rival. Eventually, the Crusaders landed in Egypt. The Shiite Fatimid state had no chance to resist the Crusaders. The only solution was to ask the Sunnis for help against them. So Al-Adid li-Dinillah sent a letter to Nureddin Zengi and asked him to help him against the Crusaders. Nureddin Zengi didn't refuse this offer of help and put an army under the command of one of his commanders, Asad al-Din Shirkuh, and sent him to Egypt. Shirkuh was Saladin Ayyubi's uncle, therefore he was also in this army with his uncle. Eventually, the Zengi army and the Crusader army came face to face on the west bank of the Nile River. Despite his small number of soldiers, Shirkuh inflicted a heavy defeat on the Crusader army. Thus, the Crusader attacks were repelled and the city of Alexandria fell into the hands of the Zengis. Commander Shirkuh left the administration of Alexandria to his nephew Saladin Ayyubi and went to the city of Said. In a short time, he cleared the city from the Crusaders and captured it. Then Shirkuh marched on the capital Cairo with his army, cleared it from the Crusaders, and took control of Egypt. The Fatimid ruler Al-Adid Lidinillah had Vizier Shave executed for his treachery and appointed the successful commander Shirkuh as Vizier instead. However, when Shirkuh died suddenly after 2 months and 5 days, his nephew Saladin Ayyubi was appointed Vizier in his place. Thus, after the death of his uncle, Saladin Ayyubi assumed the 2 important positions of commander of the Zengid Egyptian army and Vizier to the Fatimid ruler. Later, in consultation with Nureddin Zengi and as his regent, Saladin began to govern Egypt and its dependencies as an independent ruler. He fought against the Fatimid circles that resisted him and the Turks. Although the Shiites in the Fatimid court asked for help from the Crusaders to remove him from power, Saladin eliminated all his rivals in a short time. He defeated the Crusaders, who attacked Egypt. Thus, Saladin Ayyubi, who became unrivaled, completely dominated Egypt. He reorganized the army. He removed the Shiites from the state and opened Sunni madrasas and new institutions. He gradually liquidated the Fatimid bureaucracy. Finally, upon orders from Nureddin Zengi, he put an end to the Shiite Fatimid state in 1171. The khutbah began to be read in the name of the Abbasid Caliph. Thus, northern Iraq, southeastern Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, Tripolitania, Sudan, Yemen and Hejaz came under the rule of Nureddin Zengi. When Nureddin Zengi was making preparations to conquer Jerusalem, he sent a letter to Saladin Ayyubi and ordered him to come to Damascus with his army. Saladin sent a letter saying that he would come. But after a while he decided not to go. He wrote another letter to Nureddin, apologizing and saying that he couldn't come to help due to the lack of mounts. Nureddin Zengi was enraged by this letter. He wanted to go to Egypt with his army and even considered dismissing Saladin from his post. This disagreement caused a coldness between the two. A year later, Nureddin Zengi took Mileh, the son of the Armenian king Leon, into his service and used him against the Christians along the borders. The army under Mileh's command inflicted a great defeat against the Eastern Roman army. In this way, Mileh captured Adana, Missis, and Tarsus on behalf of Nureddin and captured a large amount of booty. The following year, Nureddin Zengi and the Anatolian Seljuk Sultan, Kılıçarslan II, came face to face. Nureddin Zengi didn't want a war between Muslims. Although he tried very hard for peace, his efforts were useless. Kılıçarslan gathered an army near Kayseri and confronted Nureddin Zengi. However, with the intervention of scholars who said that the war between 2 Muslim states would only benefit the Crusaders, the war was prevented and an agreement was reached. The following year, Nureddin Zengi began to gather a large army in Damascus to march on Egypt. However, he died suddenly in the castle of Damascus before leaving for the campaign. His body was transferred to his tomb at the entrance of the madrasa called An-Nuriyat al-Kubra, which he had built for the Hanafis. Nureddin Zengi was nicknamed Al-Malik al-Adil for his justice and piety. He was well versed in Hanafi fiqh and liked to engage in the science of hadith. He spent the nights in his palace with worship and dhikr, and he had drums beating at certain hours in the Damascus castle to wake those who wanted to wake up for dhikr. After Nizam al-Mulk, he opened the most madrasas. According to Ibn al-Asir, after the Rashidun Caliphs and Umar ibn Abdulaziz, there was no one better, more just and merciful than Nureddin Zengi. May Allah have mercy on him. After the death of Nureddin Zengi, his 11-year-old son Ismail succeeded him. Saladin Ayyubi initially remained loyal to Ismail, had the khutbah read in his name, and had money printed in his name. However, since Ismail was not old enough to run the state, he needed an Atabek to run state affairs. Saladin Ayyubi, the most powerful commander of the country after Nureddin Zengi, was considered the most worthy person for this task. However, taking advantage of his presence in Egypt, the Zengi commanders started to fight with each other to become Ismail's Atabek, despite the Crusader danger. A great internal turmoil broke out in the country. In Ibn Kathir's words, the emirs were at odds, ideas became confused, and confusion emerged. Evil things occurred. Drinking and prostitution became rampant. However, no one would have dared to do such things during the reign of Nureddin Zengi. It was only when Nureddin passed away that the true colors of some emirs were revealed. Finally, with the alliance of the commanders of Mosul and Aleppo, Sa'd al-Din Gumushtakin became Ismail's Atabek and took him from Damascus to Aleppo. Taking advantage of this confusion, the Crusaders started to attack the Muslims again. Finally, they decided to unite and capture Damascus. Some Zengi emirs, realizing that they couldn't defend against the Crusaders, sent a message to Saladin and invited him to Damascus. Saladin Ayyubi immediately moved towards Damascus with his army. When the Crusaders learned that Saladin was moving from Egypt, they withdrew their armies from Damascus. Saladin had two main goals. The first was to prevent the disintegration of the Zengi state, and the second was to liberate the cities in the hands of the Crusaders, especially Jerusalem. When Saladin arrived in Damascus, he was greeted enthusiastically by his supporters. Along with Damascus, Busra and Havran joined him. Saladin continued on and headed for Aleppo. He demanded that Aleppo was handed over to him. The Zengi emirs had no chance against Saladin and his army. However, the armies of Ismail and Aleppo sent letters full of insults to Saladin. Then they asked for support from Seyfeddin Zengi, the governor of Mosul. Seyfeddin Zengi was the older brother of Nureddin Zengi. He had come from Mosul to support his nephew Ismail against Saladin. The army of the people of Aleppo outnumbered Saladin's army. While Saladin was besieging the city of Hama, the armies of Aleppo moved against him. Saladin lined up his army in a single line. His brother's armies had also set out from Damascus to support him. Saladin wrote softly to the people of Aleppo to delay them until reinforcements arrived. In his letter, he said, "I will be content with the city of Damascus. Let Hama, Homs and Aleppo be yours. My service to the Zengis is many." He also used expressions such as, "I do not want to fight with you." However, when the people of Aleppo added heavy clauses to the terms of the agreement, Saladin rejected the agreement. Thereupon, war was declared. Meanwhile, Saladin's reinforcements from Damascus arrived on the battlefield. Now, the situation had changed in Saladin's favor. Saladin Ayyubi's armies outnumbered and intimidated the Zengi armies. Here, these two Muslim armies fought a fierce battle. The winner of the battle was Saladin Ayyubi. Saladin ordered his soldiers not to chase the fugitives, not to kill the wounded, and to release the captives. The cities of Hama, Homs, Manik and Azaz soon fell to Saladin Ayyubi. Saladin advanced with his army and laid siege to the city of Aleppo. The people of Aleppo made a deal with the Hashashis to assassinate Saladin Ayyubi. Some of the Hashashis disguised themselves as Saladin's soldiers, infiltrated his army, and fought in the siege. During the siege, while Saladin was walking around the front, the Hashashis seized an opportunity and attacked Saladin Ayyubi. The first attacking Hashashi hit Saladin on the head with the knife in his hand. However, the knife hit Saladin's helmet and slipped, injuring Saladin's cheek. The Hashashi then forced Saladin to the ground and tried to strangle him. When Saladin's soldiers realized the situation, they rushed at the assassin. They killed him and tore him to pieces. Then at the same moment, another Hashashi attacked Saladin, but he was also killed. Then another Hashashi was killed when he tried to attack one of the emirs. The fourth Hashashi fled so as not to endanger his life, but he too was caught and killed. That day, the siege was stopped. Saladin Ayyubi was very angry and wrathful with the people of Aleppo. After a thorough inspection of the army, the siege of Aleppo was resumed. Aleppo was closed and the people of the city were condemned to starvation. When the embattled Malik Ismail finally asked for a deal, Saladin Ayyubi decided to leave Aleppo and a few important fortresses around it to Malik Ismail on condition that he befriended him. Thus, Saladin Ayyubi returned from his expedition to become the Atabek of Malik Ismail as a Sultan. The Ayyubid Sultanate was officially recognized by the Abbasid Caliphate after this campaign. Saladin Ayyubi's rule in Syria and Egypt was thus confirmed. The Battle of Montgisard in 1071 resulted in a heavy defeat of Rome by the Seljuks, opening the gates of Anatolia to Islam. When the Turks conquered almost all of Anatolia in a short period of time, European Christians were terrified. They gathered a large Crusader army in Europe and launched an all-out attack on Muslims. This attack was named the First Crusade. When the Anatolian Seljuks failed to stop these attacks, the Crusaders landed on the eastern Mediterranean coast and established states there. Realizing that Jerusalem remained weak during these attacks, the Shiite Fatimids attacked Jerusalem and took it away from the Seljuks. The Crusaders, who established states in the eastern Mediterranean, combined their forces and advanced to Jerusalem. The Fatimids, who didn't realize that the ultimate goal of the Crusaders was Jerusalem, could not take enough measures to protect it. Eventually, after 8 days of defense, the Fatimids surrendered Jerusalem to the Crusaders. On Friday, July the 15th, 1099, the Crusaders who captured Jerusalem attacked the courtyard of Al-Aqsa Mosque and committed a terrible massacre of Muslims there. In his victory letter to the Pope, Raymond, the commander of the Crusader army, made the following memorable statements. If you ask our enemies what has been done in Jerusalem, I want you to know that our horses are knee-deep in a sea of Muslim blood. In his book The Story of Civilization, investigative writer Will Durant reports the following. Muslim women were killed with spears and swords, babies were wrenched from their mothers' arms and pushed over the ramparts or their heads smashed on poles. Researcher author Jersey said, "There is no doubt that this is a black mark on the history of the Crusades. Anyone who reads about these events will have goosebumps on his or her body and be disgusted by what was done." Arif al-Arif, a Palestinian researcher and writer, states, "The Crusaders turned the Dome of the Rock into a church and erected a large cross on its dome. All of these events helped to root the spirit of revenge against the Christians in the region and the recapture of Jerusalem in the hearts of the Muslims." The ruler who made the most effort to conquer Jerusalem was of course Nureddin Zengi. However, he was not able to conquer Jerusalem. In 1174, Saladin Ayyubi, who recovered the country after his sudden death and his country was plunged into internal turmoil, took over the slack from his master Nureddin Zengi. It was time for Saladin to fight the Crusaders. Saladin Ayyubi was constantly plotting to expel the Crusaders from the eastern Mediterranean. So much so that, according to the chroniclers of the period, whenever there was a conversation in an assembly, Saladin would somehow connect the subject to Jerusalem. The cross placed on the top of the Dome of the Rock and the voices of Muslim women and children who were massacred on Friday, July the 15th, 1099, haunted his dreams. In 1177, the Crusaders massacred Muslims around Ramla. Sultan Saladin then left Egypt to fight the Crusaders. When he came to the vicinity of Ramla, he disbanded his army and sent it to the surrounding villages and towns. There he captured some Crusaders and took booty. But Baldwin IV, the 16-year-old leper king of Jerusalem, was after Saladin with his army. While Saladin and his army of about 26,000 men were tired and disorganized, the Crusader forces suddenly appeared and cut Saladin's army in two like a spear, and with a very fast maneuver, their long spear cavalry forces encircled Saladin's army in two separate circles. By nightfall, Saladin's army had suffered more than 20,000 casualties, and Saladin Ayyubi barely escaped with his life. One of Saladin's sons was also murdered in this battle. When this news was heard, the people were terrified. Rumors that Saladin Ayyubi had been killed echoed throughout Egypt. When Saladin finally returned to Egypt with his personal guard, he was greeted with great joy and celebrations. Two years had passed, and Saladin had built new armies and devised new strategies against the Crusaders. Since Egypt was an agricultural rich country, the Ayyubid state quickly became an economically powerful state. In the same year, the Battle of Merj Uyun was fought between the Crusaders and Saladin Ayyubi. While the Crusaders were advancing along the coastline, they looked down the hill and saw Saladin's camp. Thinking that the sudden raid would be appropriate, they attacked from the hill. Since the Ayyubid army was cautious against sudden raids, it quickly took a battle stance and moved on the enemy. The winner of this battle was Saladin Ayyubi. Saladin was advancing without rest, and day by day he was capturing villages and towns from the Crusaders. Among them was the Ahsan castle, where the tomb of the Prophet Yaqub a.s. was located. The Crusaders could no longer withstand the endless Muslim attacks. The King of Jerusalem and Saladin Ayyubi signed a peace treaty in 1182. According to this agreement, the security of life and property of Christians would be ensured in return for the security of life and property of Muslims. During the peace process, Saladin Ayyubi attacked the Armenian country and conquered many castles. When Nureddin Zengi's son Ismail Zengi died in his 20s due to poisoning, Saladin Ayyubi took the city of Aleppo from the Zengis. This period of peace between Muslims and Crusaders lasted for 3 years. When the leper king Baldwin IV of Jerusalem died in 1185, the king who succeeded him announced that he was breaking this peace agreement with the Muslims. He allowed the burning of Muslim caravans and villages. Crusaders attacked a Muslim caravan returning from pilgrimage and slaughtered Muslim pilgrims. The Prince of Kerak robbed these caravans and beheaded the Muslims, laughing and saying, "Where is your Muhammad? Call him to come to your aid." Thus, the peace treaty between Muslims and Christians was broken, and the actions of the Prince of Kerak were the last straw for Saladin Ayyubi. Saladin swore by saying, "I will kill the Prince of Kerak with my own hands." After that, he sent news to all Islamic states and announced that he was preparing for the conquest of Jerusalem. Volunteer Muslims from Egypt, Syria, the Abbasids, Turks and all Muslim countries started to join Saladin's army to be in the army that conquered Jerusalem. When this news reached the Crusaders, they first thought of defending Jerusalem against the Muslims. But the new king wanted to prove himself. Therefore, he decided to confront Saladin Ayyubi with his army instead of making a cowardly defense in the city. Finally, the Crusader armies gathered and marched against the Islamic army. Saladin used a cunning tactic. He attacked the fortress of Tabariya and captured it within a day. Thus, he forced the Crusader army to fight on a battlefield of his choice, on a plain near Tabariya. Saladin had the Jordan River, which flows out of Lake Tabariya, at his back and waited for the army of Jerusalem in front of the village of Hattin. The Crusader army numbered 50,000 according to one account and 63,000 according to another. They could not find any water source until they reached Hattin. The weather was very hot and scorching. They had to break through Saladin's army to reach water. The Crusaders, who had spent the night without water, quickly attacked Saladin's army to reach water. But the Muslims drove them back. On the second day, the Crusaders were even thirstier and attacked again to reach water, but they were repulsed again. Finally, when the Crusaders were weakened by fatigue and thirst, Saladin ordered a mass attack. The Muslims drove the exhausted Crusaders into a circle. More than 30,000 Crusaders were killed, and more than 30,000 captives were taken. Among the captives were all the counts except the Count of Trebizond, including the King of Jerusalem. The Prince of Kerak, who had insulted our prophet, was also among the captives. The captives were chained and lined up in front of Saladin. Saladin, fulfilling his promise, summoned the Prince of Kerak to his tent. He told him to convert to Islam. When he refused, he severed his head with a sudden sword blow and said, "Yes, I am the deputy of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to avenge his ummah." He showed his severed head to the counts and said, "This man has been punished for cursing the Messenger of Allah." Then he ordered all knights of the temple and the Hospitallers to be killed. He ordered the rest of the prisoners to be taken to Damascus in chains. Saladin Ayyubi visited the grave of the Prophet Shu'aib in Hattin and prayed. Within 3 months after this victory, Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Tabnin, Beirut and Ashkelon were captured by the Ayyubids. The Crusaders no longer had a proper army to defend Jerusalem. When Muslims heard that Sultan Saladin had defeated the Crusaders at Hattin and was on his way to the conquest of Jerusalem, they rushed to Saladin's army from everywhere to take part in these conquests. Finally, Saladin's army arrived in front of Jerusalem and the siege began. Eyes were looking at the crosses on the walls. There was a big cross on top of the dome of the rock. This galvanized the Muslims even more. Catapults began to beat the walls of Jerusalem. When the Sultan was informed that the northeastern walls were weaker, he directed the catapults there. Finally, the northeastern wall collapsed as a result of intense catapult fire. The Crusaders came out of the collapsed wall to attempt a breach, but the Muslims encircled them and trapped them there. According to Ibn Kathir, the Crusaders finally wanted to surrender and ask for Sultan Saladin's assurance. However, the Sultan didn't accept their plea and said, "Just as you took Jerusalem by force before, I will conquer it now. Just as you killed the Muslims in Jerusalem before, I will not leave a Christian in Jerusalem that we have not killed." Then they said, "If you do not accept our surrender, we will go back. We will kill all the Muslim captives we have." There were about 4,000 Muslim captives in Jerusalem in the hands of the Crusaders. "We will kill our children and women. We destroy our homes and beautiful places. We will burn our belongings. We will destroy our possessions. We will destroy the dome of the rock and burn everything we can get our hands on. Then we will go out and fight you fiercely and throw ourselves to our deaths. After that, there is no good for us to live anymore. Not one of us will give his life without killing a few of our enemies. What good can we hope for after this?" After listening to these words, Sultan Saladin declared his consent to peace. He gave up his own opinion. He only put forward the following conditions. Men will be ransomed with 10 dinars, women with 5 dinars each, and small children with 2 dinars each. Those who cannot pay these will become captives of the Muslims. In addition, crops, products, weapons and houses will belong to the Muslims. The Crusaders will be allowed to move to a place where they will find safety, namely the city of Tyre. Thus, the peace treaty was signed. Those who could not pay these ransoms would be given 40 days. Those who could not pay the ransom within this period would be captured. The number of captives under this condition was 60,000, including men, women and children. The Sultan and the Muslims entered the city before the Friday prayer time. On the first Friday they entered the city, they took out the crosses, priests and pigs from Al-Aqsa Mosque and cleaned it. The Knights Templar had made rooms for themselves on the west side of the Great Altar. They had also taken the mihrab as a storehouse for themselves. All these places were cleaned and restored to the way they were during the Islamic period. The dome of the rock was washed with clean water, then rose water and musk was sprinkled on it. The cross was taken down from its dome. The crescent moon was put in its place. The pulpit that Sultan Nureddin Zengi had built for Jerusalem was brought. Nureddin Zengi had hoped to conquer Jerusalem himself. but it was conquered after his death by one of his followers, Sultan Saladin. The pulpit was set up next to the mihrab. Carpets were laid, candles were hung, prayer rugs were laid out. Many prostrations were made, various kinds of worship were performed. Prayers and supplications ascended to the sky, blessings came down, troubles went away. Prayers were offered. Muezzins called out the adhan, the monks felt silent, misery was gone. In places where it was said that Allah is the third of three, it was said that Allah is one. Happiness came, the jinx was gone, worship was offered to Allah, who is unborn, one, unique, without equal, to whom everything is dependent, but who himself is dependent on nothing. Truth came, falsehood went.
The news of the conquest of Jerusalem by the Muslims hit Europe like a bombshell, and Pope Gregorius VIII, who had just become the new pope, issued a proclamation declaring that the loss of Jerusalem by the Christians was God's punishment for the sins of the Christians living in Europe. All over Western Europe, it was decided that a new crusade would be launched to recapture the holy cities for the Christians. The King of England, the King of France, and the King of Germany agreed to this third crusade and started preparations immediately. In fact, in order to prevent war expenses, they decided to enact a tax law called Dima Saladina, that is to say, Saladin's tax, and to excommunicate those who did not pay this tax. Thus, among the crusading armies prepared, the Germans set off by land, while the French and English set off by sea. The army under the command of German Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa was one of the largest and best equipped armies in the history of the Crusades. The Anatolian Seljuk Sultan Kılıç Arslan II was quite old. He divided his country among his 11 sons. Each son was to be a bey under him. However, even before Kılıç Arslan passed away, his sons had already started to quarrel and even wage war with each other. Two lions do not fit in one post. The German Crusader army led by Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa was the largest Crusader army assembled during the Crusades and was well armed and well disciplined. The army marched through Hungary, through the Eastern Roman-held Balkans, towards Constantinople. This army was joined by Geza, the brother of the Hungarian King Bela III. After the great defeat at the Battle of Myokephalon in 1176, Eastern Rome stabilized the situation in Anatolia only in 1185 and signed a treaty of peace and alliance with the Anatolian Seljuk Sultan Kılıç Arslan II. The Greeks were also unhappy with the presence of the great German Crusader army in Eastern Roman territory, but there was no way for Eastern Rome to resist the size of the German Crusader army. The German Crusader army began a reorganized and gradual passage through Eastern Roman territory. Again, the Crusader army showed examples of indiscipline, and Friedrich Barbarossa's army occupied the city of Plovdiv. They also burned Adrianople. Therefore, in the fall of 1189, this army was moved to Anatolia through the Dardanelles to prevent it from coming to Constantinople. Kılıç Arslan II, on the other hand, avoided confrontation with this large German army and made a treaty with the Germans to ensure its passage through Anatolia without being subjected to Seljuk offensives. However, his sons and Turkmens were not satisfied with the situation. Since he had already divided his country among his 11 sons, Kılıç Arslan II seemed to have no de facto power. The Turks ambushed the German Crusader army advancing in Anatolia inflicting serious casualties on the Germans. According to the agreement between Sultan II and Friedrich Barbarossa, the Crusaders were to pass near the city of Konya and advance into Saladin's country. When they arrived in Konya, Qutb-ud-Din Malik Shah could not bear this situation and had his father, Sultan II, arrested and took over the administration. He gathered his army and confronted the Crusaders, but he was defeated by the Crusaders. Konya was then besieged and captured by them. The capital was pillaged and plundered. The German Crusader army stayed in Konya for 5 days and started marching again. It was planned to follow the Gokse River Valley and descend to the Mediterranean. However, when the German Crusader army came out of the mountainous terrain on June 10, 1190 and reached the vicinity of Selivka, Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa I, who was a little ahead of his army and bodyguards, drowned in the Gokse River, where he went to bathe. His son Friedrich VI, Duke of Swabia, took command of the German Crusader army. Meanwhile, Turkmen attacks continued. Some commanders and soldiers, tired of the stubbornness of the Turks and emboldened by the death of their emperor, deserted the army. Saladin Ayyubi, who had heard about the Crusader attacks, had set up his defense line against the Crusaders coming from Anatolia and prepared to meet the Crusaders here. Meanwhile, the king of Jerusalem had broken his oath and besieged the Muslim-held city of Acre with the men he gathered from the Christians settled in the city of Tyre from Jerusalem. Saladin initially did not care about the siege of Acre because he was waiting for the German Crusaders coming from Anatolia. However, the German Crusaders, who had entered Anatolia with a large army, were able to leave Anatolia with very few people. Most of them had returned or been killed by Turkish attacks and the death of the emperor. When Saladin learned that the number of German Crusaders arriving was very small, he immediately turned his attention to the city of Acre, but it was too late. The French Crusader armies had arrived in Acre with their ships and supported the king of Jerusalem. 100 small ships were on their way. Some ships of the English Crusader army were caught in a storm and washed ashore off the coast of Cyprus. Among the beached ships were the sister and fiancée of the English King Richard, the Lionheart. The ship carrying the funds he had collected to finance the crusade was also washed ashore. It was learned that the ship carrying this treasure and Richard's sister and fiancée were captured by Isakos Komnenos, who ruled in Cyprus. Richard landed in Cyprus on May the 6th to take them back, and he invaded and captured Cyprus with his army. Isakos was captured at Cape of Victory on the Carpus Peninsula, the northernmost tip of the island. Richard then gathered his armies and set off for the city of Acre. The fortress of Acre was on a promontory with the harbor to the south, the sea to the west, and very strong city walls connected vertically by the north and east. The walls were defended by the Muslim armies in the city. The besieging Crusaders were in front of the walls in the shape of a half moon. Saladin had sent an army to liberate the city from the siege. Saladin's army was unable to defeat the besieging Christian army despite clashes with the Crusaders. The Christian Crusader army was constantly supported by Christian Crusaders who had recently arrived on the coast and in the ports near the city. So, there was no way to break their siege. In the winter of 1190 to 1191, many disease outbreaks broke out in the camp of the Christian besiegers. The siege was therefore considerably prolonged. On June 8, 1191, Richard the Lionheart arrived in front of Acre with his army from Cyprus. He brought many soldiers and large siege catapults. Immediately, catapults and other large siege engines were rebuilt to storm the fortress. The Muslims defending the city had no outside support and starvation was rampant. Only a few swimmers were able to establish contact with the city. In the summer of 1191, the support that the Muslim defenders of the city had asked for from Saladin was not forthcoming in the face of the size of the besieging Christian armies. On July the 11th, 1191, after a 2-year siege, the defenders of the fortress of Acre placed Christian Crusader flags on the walls and announced their surrender. The Crusaders then entered the city and plundered it. They captured 2,700 Muslim soldiers and more than 300 Muslim women and children. King Richard, the commander of the Crusaders, was unwilling to release the prisoners without a high ransom. Saladin also had Christian prisoners in his herds. If Muslims were touched, the herds of Christians would be taken in return. For King Richard, however, the Christians to be killed were of no value. Revealing his ruthless nature, he had 2,700 Muslim soldiers and about 300 women and children tied together with ropes brought to the castle gate, where Saladin and his army could see them from a distance. He led them at the mercy of the Christian Crusader knights, who swarmed on the Muslim prisoners and murdered them all, leaving no one alive. Seeing this, Saladin and his army were very upset and responded by killing the captured Christians. The son of the German Emperor, Friedrich, was killed in the siege of Acre. Philip, the King of France, was gravely ill, so he left his men to King Richard and returned home. Thus, the Crusader armies were gathered under one banner, under the command of King Richard. After capturing Acre, Richard marched south along the seacoast to Jaffa. After taking this fortress, he planned to make an offensive into Palestine towards Jerusalem. But while he was marching on the coast with his Crusader army, Saladin was following this Crusader army in parallel from the coast. Richard's Crusader naval fleet followed the Crusaders from the sea. During their march on September the 7th, Richard had expected a serious attack from Saladin and had organized his army accordingly. Richard organized the army so that it faced the land and its back was to the sea, and in this way the army moved to his right. When they reached Arsuf, 50 kilometers north of Jaffa, Saladin suddenly turned his army towards the coast and went into battle against the Crusader army. Saladin took a command position behind the main formation and ascended the hill in the Arsuf forest. The center was under the command of Aftal, the right flank under Adil, and the left flank under Ala-ad-Din bin Izz-ad-Din of Mosul. The infantry units were in the front ranks, while the cavalry was deployed in the rear. On September the 7th, 1191, the two armies fought the Battle of Arsuf at this location. Saladin had planned to slow down the advance of the vanguard of Duman by showering the rear troops with arrows, thus prolonging the march and, if possible, opening a breach in the enemy lines to allow for a good offensive. The early stages of the offensive were characterized by intense arrow fire, which forced the infantry on the Crusader left flank to march backwards, weakening the link between the left flank and the center, just as Saladin had planned. Saladin's right flank wore down Richard's left flank, while no contact was made on the other flank. The casualties were not high, but the number of mounted knights was dwindling by the minute as the Turkish horse archers deliberately targeted the horses. At this stage, the Muslim infantry had retreated to the flanks to allow the cavalry to pass. An all-out attack was launched on the Crusader left flank, including the heavy Mamluk cavalry. This left the left flank completely immobilized, and the situation became dangerous for the Crusaders. As soon as the Crusader left flank was cut off from the center, It was only a matter of time before the cavalry on Saladin's left flank would rush into the gap and devastate the Crusaders. The Muslims thought they would capture them. It was then that the cavalry on the Crusader right rallied together and decided to attack, for they feared for their men and were convinced that only an attack could save them. The Crusader right column attacked in unison along the line. This attack overwhelmed the infantry of the Muslim left column and quickly collapsed it. The Muslim troops began to scatter and flee, almost on the verge of defeat. The right flank, seeing the center retreating, also began to flee. The Crusader infantry from the rear continued to advance, murdering wounded Muslim soldiers in the process. It is said that many civilians were slaughtered by the Crusaders in the bazaar that had been set up near the camp to meet the needs of the Muslim army. Although the Muslim army retreated towards the tree-covered hills, Saladin did not leave the hill where he was standing, but instead kept his bannermen and drummers there, creating a rallying point. Ibn al-Asir narrates, had the Franks realized that this was a genuine retreat, they would have continued the chase and more Muslims would have been slaughtered. But there was a dense forest nearby and they entered it. The Franks, sensing that this was a trick of warfare, turned back and the calamity that had befallen the Muslims came to an end. The battle ended in defeat for the Muslims, but there is no clear data on casualties. Muslim sources believe that both sides lost many men. The Crusaders were victorious, but it was never a decisive victory. Saladin managed to regroup his army. The Crusaders had lost many horses, which meant that their cavalry force was even smaller. Replacing them was not an easy task. The Battle of Arsuf was an important battle. Saladin lost the lands on the coast of Palestine. It was a testament to Richard's command and to the fact that the Crusaders were not a disorganized mob, but a brave and disciplined army that listened to commands. In contrast, this battle was a black mark on Saladin's reputation as a commander. Richard then marched with his army along the coast to Jaffa and captured the fortress. Saladin had lost all of his land on the coast of Palestine, and its return to the Crusaders posed a more serious threat to Jerusalem. Richard retreated to Jaffa. He expanded the positions in the fortress and made it his general camp. The Crusader army was exhausted and needed to rest for a while. Saladin made good use of the period when the Crusader army was waiting in Jaffa. He reinforced the walls and other defenses of Jerusalem. He decided to take precautions against the possibility that the Crusaders would march on Ascalon and cut the road from Egypt, which Saladin was constantly using to reinforce his troops. He moved his army from Ramla to Ascalon and had the rich city and its fortress methodically destroyed and rendered uninhabitable. If Ascalon fell into the hands of the Crusaders, it would be impossible for the Muslims to receive reinforcements from Egypt. On the other hand, Richard faced constant problems. His army based in Jaffa began to lose discipline as supplies arrived by ship across the Mediterranean, and alcoholic beverages and other forms of entertainment became available. Cyprus was becoming ungovernable. Richard found the solution to the Cyprus problem by selling the island to the Knights Templar and handing over the administration of the island to them. In another attempt, he sent an envoy to negotiate peace with Saladin. Richard demanded the return of Jerusalem and the land around it up to the Jordan River, and the return of the true cross that the Crusaders had lost at the Battle of Hattin. But Saladin said, "Jerusalem is ours as much as it is yours. Our Prophet ascended to Miraj from there, and our Ummah will gather there on the Day of Judgment. Therefore, there is no question of abandoning Jerusalem, As for the land, you asked for the lands west of the Jordan River. That land has always belonged to us. You took advantage of the weakness of the Muslims and settled there. But as long as the war continues, we will not allow you to enjoy the places you seized. As for the cross, it is a trump card in our hands. If we get a significant concession in favor of Islam, then we can return it to you. November brought rains and bad sea conditions. Under these conditions, military operations were generally not possible. Saladin demobilized half of his army, sent it back to Egypt, and encamped the rest in Jerusalem. But Richard took advantage of this, and in mid-November, he began a major military campaign to Jerusalem. He marched on Ramla, which had been abandoned by Saladin's army. He captured the city and stayed there for 6 weeks. In Latrun, Richard celebrated Christmas. Then, on January the 3rd, he and his army reached the fortress of Beit Nuha, about 19 kilometers from Jerusalem. The Crusader soldiers, who did not know the terrain, welcomed this with great joy. But those who knew the weather and geography, especially the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers, said that it would be impossible to come down from the hills in the rain and mud and successfully attack Jerusalem in such bad weather conditions. It was also learned that Saladin's reinforcements from Egypt had arrived and were camped on one of the nearby hills, and that it was possible that they could be caught between two of his armies if the attack was started. Richard stayed in this position for 5 days and then, following the advice of those who knew the strategic situation well, decided to turn back. This was the closest Richard's army came to Jerusalem. Richard retreated with his army to the abandoned Ramla. He then planned to march through Ramla and Ibelin to Ascalon, which Saladin had destroyed. When Richard arrived in Ascalon with the Crusader army, he immediately ordered the rebuilding of the castle and the city that had been destroyed a few months earlier. Like Saladin, he understood the strategic importance of the city. For the next 4 months, Richard stayed in Ascalon and devoted his time to rebuilding it as the most protected fortress on the Palestinian coast. While Richard prepared himself and his army for this endeavor, Saladin made no offensive, and for this he was greatly criticized by some emirs. Historians attribute Saladin's relative inactivity to the fact that he wanted to give his army a period of rest. He was waiting for reinforcements to arrive from Mosul and Jazeera and believed that he could not launch a disciplined offensive with the restless emirs. They also cite the fact that he had learned through his spies that there was discord among the Crusaders and that they had major financial problems and that he did not want to reunite them by launching new offensives. In the meantime, multiplicity and disharmony began to emerge among the Crusaders. The Duke of Burgundy and some other important French commanders and soldiers abandoned Richard's army and moved to Acre. King Richard's patience was wearing thin with all these problems. The ship captains of the Republic of Pisa in the port of Acre and the ship captains of the Genoese Republic quarreled, and the Pisans attempted to occupy the city of Acre. Meanwhile, Saladin resorted to the strategy of harassing and intimidating the Crusaders by setting up ambushes with small units. As the battles of maneuver continued into the summer, Richard made clear his intention to retreat because he was about to lose his throne. The other Crusaders under his command wanted to attack Jerusalem, but attacking Jerusalem without securing the supply lines would have been suicidal. In July 1192, the Crusader army under Richard withdrew to the north of Palestine. Unable to take Jerusalem and exposed to attack on the coast, Saladin's army attacked the fortress of Jaffa, which had previously been the center of operations for the Crusader assault on Jerusalem, and after a 3-day siege, they captured the city and the fortress. A small number of defenders retreated to the citadel. This Muslim army had not forgotten that the Crusaders had brutally murdered all of the approximately 2,700 defenders and some 300 women and children who surrendered at the siege of Acre. Saladin's army launched a revenge massacre against the Crusaders in Jaffa. They left no Crusader soldiers alive and took no prisoners. Saladin Ayyubi tried to prevent this, but the soldiers lost control. It is said that Saladin then sent word to the defending Crusaders to retreat to the citadel and defend themselves. When King Richard heard of the attack on Jaffa, he loaded his army's knights in armor and Italian archers from Pisa and Genoa onto ships anchored along the coast to the north and hurried to Jaffa. On July the 31st, Richard disembarked with 55 knights in armor, several hundred infantrymen, and some 2,000 bow-wielding Genoese and Pisa soldiers, and attacked the fortress. On the same day, the city fell back to the Crusaders. The Muslim soldiers, who had captured Jaffa and defended the fortress against Richard's attack, were able to flee the city. Saladin was only able to stop this flight about 10 kilometers from the fortress, and only then he was able to reorganize his army. Saladin received word that Crusader reinforcements were coming to defend Jaffa. They took immediate action and attacked the city early the next morning. On August the 5th, Saladin's slightly armored Egyptian cavalry units suffered heavy casualties as they charged into the city. Some Muslim soldiers managed to enter the city, but Richard arrived with his own troops and forced the Muslim troops to withdraw. In the evening, Saladin recalled his army and began to retreat towards Jerusalem. The Battle of Jaffa ended in a victory for Richard, but he had no means of consolidating this victory as he had no reserves. Due to his extraordinary personal effort, Richard became exhausted and ill. He had to stay on his sickbed with a high fever immediately after the battle. By contrast, when Saladin returned to Jerusalem, fresh and trained troops, freshly arrived from Egypt and northern Syria, were waiting for him. Saladin could have continued the battle, but Richard's patience was running out. Not only was he exhausted, but reports from England indicated that his brother John had started a rebellion to seize the throne. Therefore, Richard wanted to conclude a peace treaty as soon as possible and return to England. However, the main point of contention in the negotiations between Saladin and Richard was Ascalon. Saladin would never give up Ascalon. Moreover, he imposed on Richard to dismantle the stones of the castle built in Ascalon, one by one. Richard gave up all his other demands, but begged to at least keep Ascalon. When he received a negative response, he sent an ultimatum that he would have to spend the winter there. Saladin, on the other hand, knew that Richard was bluffing, that he was not here to stay, and that he had to make peace one way or the other. He said, "If you want to spend the winter 2 months away from your country and your family, go ahead. If you ask me, I can spend the winter and then the summer, then another winter and another summer here, because this is my hometown. I have one army for the summer and another army for the winter. I will sit and wait like this until Allah grants victory to one of us." Eventually, Richard gave up Ascalon and the Treaty of Ramla was signed. According to the agreement, the French would retain the coastal area from Tyre to Jaffa, but would accept Saladin's authority over the rest of the country. Ascalon would remain in Muslim hands, and the stones of the fortress would be removed one by one. Christians were also given free passage to Jerusalem. The Crusaders visited Jerusalem unarmed before leaving the Holy Land, but Richard did not join them. On September the 10th, Saladin demobilized his army, and a month later, Richard sailed with his army from Acre to England, bringing the Third Crusade to an end. The end of the Third Crusade satisfied neither Muslims nor Christians. Many Muslims were unhappy that Saladin had ceded the important southern coast of Palestine to the Christians who had usurped it, and that the Kingdom of Jerusalem based in Acre and the Count of Tripoli based in Tripoli still ruled there. Hattin ibn al-Shaddad, Saladin's personal secretary and biographer, reported that Saladin said, "I am afraid to make peace because I do not know what will happen to me. Our enemies will grow bigger and stronger because we have given them these lands. They will come back to recapture the lands they had abandoned before. I expect to see each of them wrapped and protected in their fortresses, from which they will proclaim, 'I will stay here,' and the Muslims will be devastated." These were his words, and then it happened exactly as he said. The Christians were also disheartened that Jerusalem had not fallen into Christian hands, and that most of the lands and fortresses that had been captured and seized in the First Crusade had not been returned to Christian hands, or even that the Muslims had not been completely eliminated and wiped out. This failure of the Third Crusade would lead to the launch of the Fourth Crusade 6 years after 1192. Saladin, who had been at the front for years, was tired and sick. His soldiers were also worn out. Shortly after the end of the Third Crusade, he died in Damascus on March 4th, 1193. At that time, khutbahs were read in his name in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, southeast and northern Iraq. He was fluent in Kurdish, Arabic, Turkish and Persian. It is also said that he was a well-educated Hafiz. By destroying the Fatimids in Egypt, he ended the Shiite domination in the region and established a strong state organization. His second great achievement was conquering Jerusalem from the Crusaders and liberating many places held by the Crusaders. As a result, he was nicknamed the Conqueror of Jerusalem and became one of the most famous heroes of the Islamic world. Scholars and students came from all over the Islamic world to the madrasas he established in Egypt, and they wrote many scholarly works and turned Egypt into a center of knowledge by cleansing it from the Shiites. Ibn Shaddad describes his knowledge of history as very strong and his culture as broad. He was a follower of Nureddin Zengi in all matters, complementing the work he had begun, and did not even claim to have founded a new state. He kept his promises at all costs and loved to forgive. He was extremely generous, and it is narrated that when he died he had only 1 Egyptian dinar and 46 dirhams in his private treasury. Eastern and Western historians have always praised him, even the Crusaders admired him. May Allah have mercy on him.